Welcome to a new episode of the podcast. Today is a solo episode where I'll be talking about 10 keys for a more complete training program. And that's not only a sports performance or an athletic performance program or a strength training program or a speed training program. These 10 keys can apply to any skill you are working on. So it could be speed training, jump training, throwing, swinging a baseball bat or a golf club. This is a very general podcast to help whatever program, whatever you're working for in your athletic development to be more complete and have more angles that you can work that program. Before we get started with the podcast, I want to highlight our show's sponsor, which is Gym Studio. Gym Studio is a frictionless gym management software. It will automatically handle billing, memberships. To get a free 14-day trial, you can head to gymstudio.com. So let's get into these 10 keys. And the first is to embrace constraints and limitations. This is something or a topic that I've had come up numerous times on the podcast between guests like Dan John, Mark McLaughlin, as well as many others. And one of the big things, a story that I think is applicable to this, is Mark McLaughlin shared with me this story back of music in the 80s. Actually, this may have been in the 70s, I think. But back in the day, I enjoy watching musical artists. I enjoy seeing how people had to make do with the technology limitations at the time. I've heard stories even of things like that little Microsoft, when Windows opens up, you get like the little tone, or how they had to work with the very limited data processing with the old Nintendo platforms to get the little sound effects in Super Mario. It's fascinating because there was so many constraints. You didn't have all these things at your fingertips. And it really changed the creative dynamic and the making do. And that also applies to athletics and athletic development. And there's so many pros or elite players in multiple disciplines who have come up with constraints. So I'll share first this story from Led Zeppelin. I'm not going to lie, Mark told this to me, but I had to look it up and get a little bit more reference. But it was When the Levee Breaks by Led Zeppelin. In 1971, it was the year. And so they faced challenges getting the drum sound they wanted in the studio that they were faced with recording. So it was Headley Grange, and there was some acoustic challenges, and they had to shift strategies. They had to set up, John Bonham had to set up his kit in a reverberant stairwell. Engineer Andy Johns had to place mics on the second floor to capture the natural echo. And then through them using the space creatively, they came up with this sound that was just amazing. And it was very, it's iconic. And that wouldn't have happened if it wasn't for the constraints of the space they were recording in, where now you're going to get very preset and standardized recording studios. So bottom line, there was things that happened in music that just happened because of the natural constraints. And then we can take these out into sport itself. And some things that come to mind, amongst others, is in the book Bounce, which is about table tennis. A track coach at Cal, Matt Chisholm, gave me the book. So in that book, one of the main stories was a player, his name was Desmond. I can't remember his last name, but he was the most lightning fast player. I've written about him before, but one of the most lightning fast players in the world in table tennis. And people tested his reflexes, and it turned out, like on basic raw reaction tests, he was no different than anybody else. But what happened was he grew up playing with the constraint of playing in a very small and confined space where his back was against the wall. And so he had to develop his perception of the game faster and more effectively than other players. And he could basically just stand at the front of the table and just move with like lightning, you could say almost like out of the Matrix level velocities. And so that's something where if it wasn't for that, if it wasn't for playing in that garage, he wouldn't have developed that reaction time or whatever it was, the small confined space. He wouldn't have developed the reaction time that he did. So as well as that, there's many other stories. Dan John talks about the constraints and limitations of working at a small high school with limited resources and options. I think one of the stories I still remember from the first podcast we did was where he talked about training a girl with a rock, like a champion shot putter. I think they had to use a rock at some point on some level. And Dan had talked a lot about the importance of just not having it all in your gym, having to make do, and that making do giving you a lot of creative options and ideas. On a recent podcast, Kevin Mulcahy talked about Gaelic football and sport in Ireland and some of the unique constraints and gameplay styles that came up from these clubs who would have to play right on the coast. So it's like really windy and wet. and you can't throw the long passes. So they evolved a short game that really worked well out of that constraint of always having a ton of wind and rain. And so things that come up in nature or just making do are really important. And then if we talk about like the myth side of things, mythology, of course, we have the Rocky training series where he's just like, he's in Siberia and he just has some tools and he's figuring out ways to train with those things. There is something about that, having tools that you must figure out training methods and means. And that is part of the process. So finding ways to make do, to be creative, especially when you may have a lot of training tools, I think is helpful. And one practice that you can use there is just to take one training tool and just train with that for a period of time. So for example, a sandbag, that's what I've been onto recently, just finding ways to get my strength out of a sandbag, especially for the lower body, like the total floor-based, like replacing basically barbell squats and deadlifts for a time. Finding ways to work that, finding ways to do squats, working with it up the hill. So sprinting up the hill forward, sprinting up the hill backwards, doing circuits of that with general like Hindu push-ups or push-up based work and getting a strength workout that way versus what you typically have. You're going to learn a lot, but you're also going to get a really novel effect and learn different ways about methods and ideas about how your body works in strength training. So just finding more ways to constrain the program occasionally and finding ways to make do there is absolutely huge. The last thing I'll say there as well is just in my own work and around the neighborhood here. So at my home, I'm on a small hill, but then there's also other hills that you can run to that are like a kilometer down the road. So recently I've been running a kilometer to a hill there, working on that hill, and then I'll run back. And so it's interesting to explore the landscape of your training area. So finding all the nooks and crannies and interesting things in your environment, and then also using that to your creativity. I know, and I'll mention this later on this episode, but Paul Cater taught me a lot about many things, and I'll talk about him on the scope of music and rhythm, particularly in this show. But something I always thought was interesting as well is he was trained in a very natural setting in Monterey, California. So when I was there, his gym was right next to the beach. We would go to the beach and he had these different dunes that we would be creative and train on. You could sprint up or run down, and he had the tallest one he called El Capitan. So you're putting like a story behind it. So just finding things in your environment, making do. If you don't have constraints, almost forcing them at times, because it does force you to be creative in new ways, shapes, and forms. All right, next thing or next key on the list is studying physical education. So physical education, it's interesting because I know when I was in college for exercise science and eventually graduate school in applied sports science was my master's degree, physical education was almost looked on as kind of the kids who just wanted to play, like as if it wasn't serious coaching. And nowadays, more people who get into coaching have degrees or master's degrees in exercise science, or maybe it's management, or maybe it's an education type master's, but not a physical education. And a lot of the older coaches from decades past, they would get their degrees in physical education. And I even saw, I think it was Phil London, who I've talked about with Cal Dietz. He was the track coach in Minnesota when Cal Dietz was there, and prolific track coach of the year. 4x4s were running just absolutely lightning times that you would think kids in cold Minnesota had no business achieving. And I believe Phil had a bachelor's at least, maybe a master's in physical education, and then a PhD in biomechanics. And so it's like this base of physical education working into the more specific. And what I think happens a lot is we get people in sports performance, especially in coaching, we get a lot of theory in school. There's a lot of like muscle physiology and studying these very small parts of it all. The idea would be too, if you're a cook, it'd be like studying the molecular makeup of the items you're cooking with to some level. I mean, it's not completely like that, but as an illustration, I think there's a lot of coaching theory from this very theoretical value that doesn't offer immediate training implication. And then what I found is it's almost like we have to learn the physical education as we go along. And what I mean by physical education as well, I think people might think of physical education as just kids hitting balloons around and having them run through hula hoops or learn, basic musical, like working to music, which honestly is really important, by the way. But physical education essentially is the base of literacy, movement literacy, how to teach kids and how to progress kids through movement and movement progressions. And the interesting thing is a lot of people, they aim to be university sports performance coaches, college sports performance. And the thing is a lot of those athletes, especially the higher level athletes, will come in and have a lot of basic movement competencies. But a lot of athletes don't have all the pieces there. And then you go right into the more intensive training exercises, the high output things, and you're going to track it with data. But at the same time, a really big part of the process is having all the pieces there. So, and if you don't have the pieces, yes, if you're 18, 19 years old, it's very difficult to go back and to relive like a really rich physical education of a youth that you may have missed, especially things with free play. But at the same time, I do believe that pieces of general physical education and movement literacy should be in any training program, regardless of the level. And the higher level athletes, maybe it's just a little bit here and there at the beginning of the season. But I'm not saying like you're jumping through hoops and hitting balloons around, although you could. And honestly, that's a piece that we'll be getting to in this podcast later, is some of those very basic skills can create a lot of intention and fun to actually deliver a more rich experience. For example, if you're going to do plyometrics, a lot of times we only look at the plyometrics as, okay, we're going to do this volume. Here's the cues. Here's the ground reaction forces. And it's a very, very mechanical way of looking at it. And of course, there's great benefits through those plyometrics. You're going to be getting a lot of very power output oriented things, but you can have a more rich experience by, let's say, warming up with more physical education style work. If you warm up with the plyos, not by coaching the athletes and giving them a laundry list of drills and cues and what they should be doing, but rather warm them up through some physical education. Hey, let's jump over these hoops. Can you jump over these hoops on a single leg? Can you jump up on a single leg and hit this balloon and keep it in the air? Those things are fun. It keeps athletes engaged. It works a different frame of their mind and their attention. And ultimately as well, I find this is I think there's a lot of value, and I've heard this from many podcast guests. There is a ton of value in just being able to coach kids because you understand the core of us as humans, what we find interesting, what we find enjoyable, how we move, how we develop movement over time. I just think there's so much there in that physical education. And I'll also lump in just the youth sports training. Think ages like 5 to 10, just a lot of different sports, because you learn how people learn, you learn attention, and you learn those basic fundamentals of movement. And if we get too disconnected from that, I do think that can be an issue, because more so, I think there's just something we miss. I think you can run a program like that and, be fine in terms of ticking the boxes. But I think there's also a fundamental human quality that we miss that can make the program a little bit less enjoyable. And it also can miss a lot of ticking a lot of important boxes just for fundamental movement skills. So bottom line, a lot more coaches used to have physical education backgrounds. I like the anecdote of Phil London then moving into something more specific and more nuanced for the needs of his athletes, where now it's like we start with the atoms and the molecules and try to make sense of it, and everything is a little bit more output oriented. So I think you want both. You want the outputs, you want the data, and you also want the learning, that basic movement competency behind it, that basic learning, the way a child learns. And then you find an appropriate middle for the group that you're working with. All right. Next one we have, and I talked about this with Paul Cater, but incorporating rhythm and music. So this is one of those things where if I had to list like the defining moments that changed my program, that changed the way I think about things in my career, training with Paul and just learning the fullness of working to music and rhythm has absolutely been one of those. So I had the good fortune to reconnect with Paul. I actually met him in Spain on a training trip. This was 10 years prior in 2005, and then reconnected back, close to 2015, maybe it was 2014. And we both were living in I was in San Francisco, Berkeley, working at Cal, and he was down in Monterey. So we reconnected, and I was able to get some training in with Paul. And it's awesome because I had heard ideas on music before and rhythm before, but it's not until you actually go through an embodied session where you really understand that full potential. And I'll say this because I talked about outputs in the previous point, is training, let's just say sprint drills, because some of the warm-ups would be Paul just going through sprint drills to different musical constraints. Maybe there's different upbeats and downbeats to the song where you're not just trying to resist the ground on every single beat, but you're actually going down and yielding on certain beats, and you're doing it in rhythm, and it's fun and it's very intentional. I found that doing some of those basic drills, even the speed ladder, people will make fun of the speed ladder, but when it's done to music and it's done intentionally and athletes are finding rhythmic elements to it, and this is what great coaches from the 80s and 90s have also said, is there's a rhythmic element to the speed ladder if you use it that way. If you try to use it as a speed coverall, then of course it has serious shortfalls. But using it as a rhythmic and attentional training tool in footwork is actually a really good thing. And so bottom line is, working with Paul in these trainings, I improved my vertical in a single session by about 5. I mean, I'm just saying from, and obviously warming up, you're going to come in and you're not going to be jumping that high, and then you'll jump high throughout the workout. But that was the best potentiation that I had in doing the training and warm-ups with him, because it was so intentional, moving to rhythm. You're warming up your body really well. I felt very similar to how I would warm up playing basketball, which I will say, playing basketball is the ultimate warm-up for jumping, and training with Paul and working through music rhythm through intentional pieces, I felt very similar to that basketball warm-up, and it was way superior to other, you could just say more canned warm-ups, where you're doing the drills, you're doing the A skips, you're doing the B skips, you're doing the lunges, all good things without question. But again, that's the point of this podcast, is what can I add to a program? How can I make that program better? How can I make it more complete? You can make it more complete by adding music. And so in learning from Paul, I found that you would enjoy it more and increase those outputs. You're jumping higher, you're sprinting in a more connected manner. And so I've also heard as well athletes or like hurdle coaches who would have the hurdle drills done to music to develop that sense of rhythm. And so there is a lot of applications. I'll say the most simple one. So if you don't want to bust out, I use a lot of like Latin music. I've gotten that inspiration from Paul and that idea from others, but I'll use that in just running, teaching running, getting a sense of rhythm and like single leg hopping. So you can just turn the music on to 130 beats per minute, just have athletes do single leg hops and use that to warm up, and then transition it into sprints or runs. Something that Max Shank had said. Max was around the 200 mark in the podcasts here series. And he had said the best way to this baseline experience elasticity in music is just dance for 15 or 5 minutes. Just turn music on and just hop around to it for 5 minutes. And if you do that, and back to the physical education thing, do that with a group of young athletes, they may not have the attention span for 5 minutes, but you do it for a minute or two and they like it. It's really enjoyable, just having fun, hopping up and down to the music. It doesn't have to be perfect, but just doing something like that is a booster. It can offer a more complete spectrum for elasticity in a program. And Paul is the master of these things. I text and message him frequently on different songs, different applications, and things like that. So if you want to follow Paul Cater on Instagram, there as well. He has a lot of great ideas and concepts on the level of rhythm and training application. The next key is to work in waves or polarities. In some ways, they're similar, but what I mean by that is this. Let me first talk about weekly programming. So it's a concept in weekly training, and this is more of a sprint training, a power training thing, but I think it's important for many skills, many strength and output skills, is to polarize the training, meaning, and this comes from Charlie Francis in many ways. I'm sure on some level it existed more. It existed, but he's the one who has popularized and refined and made this easy and simple to understand for the coaching world. But if you're going to train sprinting, he would polarize it in the sense that you have 3 days a week that are high intensity, so maximal or close to maximal level sprint outputs, shorter efforts, or really quality speed endurance efforts. And then the other 3 days, so the days in between those, are very low intensity, extensive tempo. So very low, like think 60 to 70%. You're not straining, you're doing a volume of work, you're kind of flushing the body, but you're still getting work in, but it's work that is recovering the previous high intensity speed day. And when we start with that polarization and that polarity, then we can work to more complex systems, or maybe we have potentiation days and we have days that back-to-back training days where you're really beefing up that stimulus. Maybe you do a strength and a power or a plyometric day back-to-back and then have a recovery day, which I will use a lot. But having polarities is an important part of a weekly training program for outputs. And I'll say more complete program, a lot of people do that. But what I'm getting at is talking about that on the level of skill and in the single workout. So if we're talking about things like, and let's just say sprinting, but this could be anything, any skill, is if I'm trying to teach someone the right technique or make their technique and abilities more robust, a lot of people will just say, okay, all right, we're going to run 4 or 5 or 6 10-meter flies, and they're all this percentage, and here's some cues along the way. And of course, that type of training can absolutely get results. I think that's a good way to train, but a more complete way for a lot of athletes, as well as just to have a richer experience, is to draw some polarities into that. So for example, let's say you're doing 6 10-meter flies. And I know a lot of times the prescription is like 4 or something like that, but let's just say you're doing 6 or whatever it is. And let's say half of those flies, and I want to teach athletes technique. Let's say we're working on an aspect of their stride, some sort of aspect of their stride length or stride frequency. What I can do is I can say, okay, the odds are going to be high stride frequency. You're going to run these 10 flies and you're going to try to spin your wheels pretty quick. I want to see a high stride frequency for these. And the other ones, so if that was the evens, the odds would be, I want a long stride length. Okay, so really punch that stride length out. And as they run through that, they're going to feel the differences and see the times that result from each strategy. And then you run a bonus rep at the end and then say, okay, now just do what feels good. Try to let that settle and integrate and notice what feels good. And I find finding a space for that polarity, those extremes, and it doesn't have to even be just that. You could just do it in warm-up strides. You could say, all right, do a long stride length, 60 build-up, a quick stride, 60 build-up, and then do something that feels good. And you could repeat that cycle another time. And you could do that with anything. Any skill, you can find the max length output, the max frequency output, and find yourself somewhere in the middle. You could, like a vertical jump, for example, you could be doing standing vertical jumps, and you could say, all right, the first one, the odds you're going to go, don't bend your knees very far at all, a little bit, but not much. The evens, you're going to squat down a ton, and then at some point, you're allowing them to integrate and find the gaps. This fits too what Jay Schrader had talked about, working joint angles. And if you work the most extreme angle, think extreme isos, and then you work the minimal angle, think like a poppy, like calf pogo or something, or an altitude drop where you don't let your knees bend too much. You obviously want to let them bend just a little bit, but you keep the whole system relatively rigid. Jay had talked about the body filling in the gaps in the middle. And I don't think it's necessarily quite as simple as that. I think I like that exploration and learning and the nuances of that, like I just mentioned with, okay, sprint long, sprint short, now fill in the middle. That's something that can be done for a variety of skills, but I think it's nonetheless, and that was more speaking from the outputs perspective, what Jay was talking about. But I think that it's important that not only do we look at using a polarity to help us define our initial training weeks and understanding how athletes adapt from a macro level or a more macro level. Obviously, you have the whole training year as your biggest macro, but just how you plan the week. But it also can fit in the session itself. And to me, one of the most extreme versions, it's not extreme, it just sounds extreme because I think it doesn't intuitively make sense when you talk about it, but it's the exaggerate the error or amplify the error techniques. And so if you are amplifying the error, that's drawing a polarity because you have where you are now an extreme wrong. And then you fill in the gaps. And so, for example, I'll use this regularly. I've been using it, finding ways more and more to use it throughout the scope of practice. I'll just talk about how I use it for a high jump practice. And like I mentioned, I think this is something applicable to all skills. And it keeps athletes very engaged. It keeps them from going through the motions. We'll do, in high jump, if you're not familiar, you have to run a straight section. This is the flop method. You run a curved section, and then you run into your final takeoff steps and take off. And so for that curved section, I'll usually set up cones on the track just to practice it in a circle or an ellipse. And I try to do an ellipse if I can because it fits to the actual jump curve that you run, the changes in it. But I'll have athletes do it wrong, superset doing it wrong with running normal. And when I say run it wrong, I'll have them, and if you listen to the Dave Karen episode on curve running, it was awesome. But the wrong way is just to go cone to cone like you're making cuts. You're not running a curve. You're just run to the cone, then cut to the next cone, then cut to the next cone, then cut to the next cone. And if you do that, you won't feel a sense of lean that you need in high jump. And then we'll do that a couple times, and then I'll have them do, all right, just run the curve like I showed you, try to mirror it. And the change is amazing. And it's something that I couldn't get if I said actively was cueing and instructing them. So I'll try to get those emergent actions to happen, like when you do two polarities and then you just see what happens. Those are the most pure outcomes. And research shows this. Research shows that amplifying the error allows greater, better outcomes than trying to actually coach people up. And if we're talking about outputs, I know, if we're just talking like jumping and sprinting, standing long jump is one of the premier studies where Amplify the Error just crushed actively coaching athletes in that output driven drill. So those things are really important. Waves as well, just I'll briefly touch on that. So, and that's kind of like what I mentioned is having, yes, you could do run short, run long, run in the middle. It's kind of a wave of sorts, but also having waves of effort. So one of the things I remember picking up from swimming, this is when I was at Cal, is it was great not just being in the weight room with those athletes, but going to the pool, going to the deck and watching the coaches who were Olympic level coaches and led Olympic teams. Is I would see coaches. I remember this one of Dave Durden there at Cal. His the way he worded things was really good too, because sometimes I think we don't think enough about the language that we use and how that registers with an athlete and how we're modulating their attention and effort. But Dave was having athletes do is like I think they were wearing like socks, so it constrained their kicking and going off the wall. And he said, you're doing 3 efforts. It wasn't as simple as this, but just to simplify, all right, you're going to do 3 efforts, do the first one moderate, and the second one get better, and the next one get better. And it's interesting because it does bring you in the moment of, okay, how do I get better from the next one? But you also have to be thinking, okay, I also have to give myself enough space to be the best on the 3rd effort. And so being able to modulate different series and sequences of effort is really important, and it can give an athlete a more robust experience to ultimately get a better result. And so I'll use that type of thing a lot of times in various outputs, various plyos, various sprints, waves and polarities, a great addition to a total training program. And I do think, I will say, sometimes once you start getting into these waves and polarities, it's not the only way, because it works so well. But I have to remember, I'm saying this for myself, I have to remember it's not the only way to train. You can get great results just by saying, hey, we're just going to go run 3 max sprints today or 4 or 5 max sprints today and just try to be your best on all of them, because you need that experience too. Because athletes through that experience, they will find that they may have tried, there inevitably will be a sprint or 2 that is slower because they maybe tried harder, they tried too hard. They're going to figure out what is trying too hard, but they also have a lot of reps and intention and full intention. So there is learning in everything. And I just think that's really important for a total complete program, is see where and how will an athlete learn in this setup? How will an athlete learn in this setup? And having different ways and different approaches, different ways to approach that learning, I think is really important. The next key is to use complexes. So using complexes in training, of course, we have things like French contrast is a really popular one. People watch and love the Werner Gunther training series. I watched there was a video that Christian Thibodeau had put out on his social media talking about, I think it was Canadian descending training. So basically working from something that's heavy to something that's light. At some point, I think all training systems should have some level of complex or sequencing to them. I'll start with this, though, just to kind of kick this off, because I will say, and with that Canadian descending, as I've seen it, almost every great like speed and power coach has some form of that active in their training. That goes for speed coaches, throws coaches I've seen, athletes that got tremendous results in the throws. This was when I was working as a strength coach, and I just noticed this like a light. Throws coach came in who was using a lot of that, and athletes improved so fast, a lot of that descending and potentiation-based system. So using some level of that, I think, is critical. But I think where we can get thrown off a little bit, and this is interesting because this goes back to how we learn as coaches and how education is applied, is I remember this is when I was in grad school. And I really appreciated my grad school experience because I remember one class very specifically where we went through, it was like a current topic like HIIT or high intensity training versus standard training on vertical jump outputs. And honestly, the results of the research was very surprising. HIIT did a lot better than you would give it credit for in many situations. I think it was coupled with athletes being explosive outside of that. So that's the thing you always need to look at, is you can't just look at one particular ingredient. But we went through a lot of research. And one thing I remember going through a lot was potentiation and potentiation-based studies. And the results were kind of inconclusive when it becomes a very atomized system. For example, okay, we're going to do a max set of squats, and then we're going to do a max vertical jump, and let's see if potentiation worked. And just remember, that's only one way of warming up. I mean, if you warmed up with Paul Cater's rhythm warm-up, you'd probably be jumping way higher than a squat potentiation in many cases. And then you could layer squats in there, and it could be even better if you're doing it appropriately. This is an art form. So anyways, the thing is, if you look at a lot of it from a very, you could say, clinical manner, and you're only looking at a max lift and a vertical jump or something, you are going to get mixed results. You're going to get different athletes at different levels and appreciations of the lifting. Like an athlete who's built for lifting and loves lifting and has a good nervous system is probably going to get a great potentiation effect out of that lift. For other athletes, you may have to modulate the lift to their levers, to how their body, their bones, their pelvis expands throughout the lift. So they're having a really good pressure-based strategy and they're not compensating. You have a lot of factors, as well as how strong an athlete's nervous system, rest times. There's a lot of things if you're only looking at like a max lift and then a max vertical. But once you can scan out a little bit and realize that there's a lot of ways to achieve potentiation in complex training, you have a lot more options available, and you can actually start at more basic and rudimentary levels. You could just think of it like as a warm-up plus, really. Like when we warm up for anything, we do jog, or maybe we don't jog. We do some crawls, some skips, some lunges, some different movements, like just various movements that we all do for warm-up. As the blood gets flowing and muscle temperature goes up and we just start to gain senses of rhythm and movement and velocity, yes, we'll always improve our abilities. But then you could say, okay, what if you throw some plyometrics into that warm-up sequence? Well, yeah, you probably will improve. If you want to do some sprint outputs, you'll improve your sprint outputs more in many cases. Maybe some people do better with lifting, or you have throws, you have games. And so the ways that we can potentiate the body, we have motor output-based potentiation, so a heavy lift or maybe a maximal iso pull that really activates the fullness of our motor units. Okay, that's something that offers potentiation. We have metabolic potentiation, which sounds crazy, but that's something like running a fast 150 or a 200. That is nervous system, but it also has some of the metabolic pieces of the muscle. It's getting those involved as well. And if you've or listened to shows where it was Mark Wetzel initially talking about how long energy bursts can recover short, which is just awesome. It's a really important concept. We have that interplay. It can, obviously, there's a limit to that. Like you're not going to run a maximal 400 and then come back 5 minutes later and have your highest vertical. That's moving into the extreme end, but the shorter end of that, you can get some really cool metabolic-based potentiation. We have technical potentiation, so the skill development and skill learning pieces. Within that even could be like sensory, like you're having athletes sense something that's important to the output. You have attention-based potentiation, so tasks and goals. You could be doing things like games, essentially, which is part of it. As soon as you flip the script from, okay, put your arm here, put your leg here, do this internal thing, to just have fun and do tasks outside of yourself, that also offers a level of potentiation. We also have flipping skills. So you could think running backwards and running forwards on the most basic level, but you could have things like, and this back to swim coaching, this was something that I learned from Dave as well. He had an Olympic swimmer who he found if she did a bunch of backstroke reps, then she would flip to freestyle and the freestyle would be better. But then he would have to go back to having her do backstroke to kind of offload that, to offload the systems and flip back to freestyle, and the freestyle would be better versus just doing a bunch of freestyles back to back to back to back. And again, some athletes, a lot of programs just do that. And there's other reasons that you can be successful through those programs. But at the same time, there's something to, hey, if this works better for this session, why don't we take advantage of this? And then finally, there's potentiation through tuning. And I mentioned that, doing warming up, rhythm and frequency. A lot of times if we're doing various skips and hops in the warm-up, or hurdle mobility that's to a rhythmic level, there's a rhythm to that, and that can tune the body. And that's something Paul had talked about as well in the podcast that we did talking about that topic. So ultimately, learning to take all these tools I just listed and bringing them together in a program, and then finding, some athletes are going to do better with some than others. Some athletes will thrive on the motor outputs, the heavy weights, the heavy isos, those types of things. And honestly, on some level, that is good for most all athletes. Even if you have a weaker nervous system, I think there's still something there. Maybe just go a little bit lighter, use a shorter range of motion. You're more rhythmic in how you do it, and then you mix that with whatever plyometric or sprint or whatever you're doing. But some athletes are going to do better with more metabolic potentiation, and that's also scalable. Like your pure fast twitch machine, wide infrasternal angle, if you're going to be supersetting them with a longer thing, maybe their long effort is only like 120 meters. Maybe it only takes them, I don't know, 14 seconds of work or something, or 15 seconds of work. And then if they keep doing more, it's going to dig into the next explosive thing they do. Whereas other athletes, maybe they can do up to 20, 25 seconds of work, maybe 30 seconds on occasion. You give them longer rests, but some athletes are just wired that way. And then, of course, the technical potentiation. This is a huge thing. This was something I found just back in the day coaching javelin at Wilmington College. I remember this was just something I did figure out just through trial and error. Is I always found in coaching, and especially it was in practice, but it was also honestly even in meets, I would have athletes go through circuits of throwing javelin, and a lot of it was very controlled, but they would superset throws with a lot of just different step and feel the stretch of the javelin. Javy, which is like a javelin or a little handle of a javelin on a cord to feel the specific mobility you needed at foot strike, different medicine ball release drills. So I would superset a lot of those sensory and small technical drills in with the throws and got a lot better results with that. And I found if it was just, hey, go throw, let me tell you something, go throw, let me tell you something, that just led to a lot of confusion. Javelin's a really technical event. You need to go and have, like Liz Gleedle, javelin thrower, she talks about side quests. You go on this little side quest and it teaches you something, and then you take it back to your main skill. So you're learning without having to rely on cues. And the thing with javelin, and the reason I'll say this taught me so much is because javelin is a very, very technical event. On the outset, you could say, oh, it's just throwing a spear. But there's a lot of things that go into throwing a long spear straight off of a long approach. There's a lot of things that happen rhythmically towards the end in terms of setting up the penultimate step, getting into the block leg, making sure the javelin stays back long enough to get that stretch load through the upper body. And so you're not just, and so the block leg, that front leg actually delivers and stops momentum. There is so much technically that goes into that event. And it's also, in some sense, throwing is innate and instinctive, but learning to throw a javelin does take a little more nuance. And so for me, I found the best way, most successful, was really to get into the technical pieces and technical potentiation of that. And funny enough, I remember there was a story, one guy got bored of that. I think he had a little bit of a short attention span, and he just wanted to go out and blast throws. And I had a few different events to coach, and sometimes I couldn't always be there for everybody's practice. I remember one day him just be like, I just want to throw it as far as I can. And and he didn't have much experience with the event either. And his distance in doing that for a few weeks, it went down, dropped 15 feet. Like he went from throwing 150 to maybe 135, and his technique was falling apart. That wouldn't happen to every athlete for sure. I'm sure there's some athletes who they're ready to put it together. But anyways, that was something that I found that was very effective in a very technical event, is finding these technical complexes and technical potentiations. Last thing I'll just say too, and this kind of maybe goes back to PE and some of the older school, so to speak, methods and literacy, is I've been going through a lot of track coach Cliff Revelto's this is from probably the 90s, I'd have to say, but maybe it's been added on through the 80s, 90s, 00s. There's so much good stuff back then. But he had all these power complexes, general strength complexes, a lot of plyometric complexes I got from Yuri Verkhoshansky's stuff, do left-right bounding, then left-right bounding, then single leg bounding, and complexing that together. Cliff has a lot of work like that in different power and med ball complexes. A lot of stuff where he'll mix short sprints actually into general strength work, so in these general strength settings. But a lot of it is all in a complex. And that's something I don't see as much of anymore in the modern day. I see less hey, we're doing this plyometric combo of these 4 or 5 exercises. And more, it just seems well, here's this new exercise. Here's this way to cue it. Here's some outputs behind it. Here's some data linked to it, which all that stuff is great for sure. But again, just going back to the complexes behind it all. I think there's so much there. And if anything, through this point, study complexes that came out of 70s, 80s, 90s, stuff that Yuri Verkhoshansky was putting out, and some of those plyo combos. It's so good. And I think that regardless, yes, for track and field, essential, but I think for many athletes, doing complexes in that realm is really helpful. Okay, next point here is embracing uncertainty. So this is one, I won't spend a ton of time here. I just think it's fascinating, is a lot of times we look at, everything in the training is for certain. Meaning, all right, here's the workout card. You know exactly what you're doing. or for here's the program on the track or in the water in the pool today, and here's the exact sets and reps. And Frank Ferencich has talked about this in his books, is there's nothing really certain in nature. Like you're getting chased by a predator. You have no idea how far you're going to run and when the chase will be over. You don't necessarily know the terrain ahead of you or what that's going to be. And so in nature, there is so much less certainty. And yet all training we tend to do and put together is all certainty. So I'll just leave it with this I follow him on YouTube at least, is Kitaro Waga. I hope I didn't mispronounce his last name, but he was a former Wim Hof practitioner. He's really into calisthenics and those types of movements as well. And he had talked about horse stance. He had a really good video on horse stance. And he had said one of his tricks to extending his horse stance was using this thing. I found something called capricious timer, but using random timers. So rather than, all right, you're going to do a set, and you know it's done in a minute. So you're strategizing through the set, or let's just say it's 5 minutes. You're strategizing through the set. Okay, I'm tired now. I got this much longer to go. Richard Chavis talked about those types of brains. Mental, basically the different ways that we look at workouts, and one of which was just the strategizing part where it's like, okay, I know I got this much left, and we intellectually strategize. If you don't know how much time you have, so if you use a random timer, your brain will perceive the entire experience differently. And I just think that's important to recognize. And Kitaro had said he had broken through personal bests many times because he would set the timer with the parameters of it could be way under your personal best, but at, technically worst case in terms of your pain in doing the set, it could end up 15 seconds breaking your personal best. But when you don't know, it does change your relationship to the movement. And so I've seen things. I remember this was back when I was at college. The head cross country coach did this thing called lottery runs. Athletes would run a 400. He'd flip a coin. And as they were going, and again, this wasn't like their staple workout, but it was something kind of to inject fun and novelty. And then they would go and he would flip the coin. And if it was heads, they had to run another 400. And if it was tails, they got to stop. Just stuff like that, just to change your attentional reference in what you're doing. There's another thing too, and I'm running a little short on my time for this podcast. But another thing is scramble circuits. When I was in college, in my own experience, our coach did this thing, and athletes love this. It was a recovery day. So it was like, think of your extensive tempo day. You're just going to go out and run 6 easy 200s or something and do some abs. We would just run around randomly. The coach would lead us. He'd be like, all right, we're going to run over here. And then he would say, okay, now we're going to do push-ups. And he would call it an athlete. How many push-ups are we going to do? The athlete says 10, and we all do 10 push-ups. Okay, now we're going to run to the next spot. We run to the next spot. And of course, we're outside. We're in nature, running, having fun. Different terrain. Maybe it's up the stadium steps. Okay, now we're here. Now we're going to do these abs. How many reps? And someone says 50. And I was like, 50, but it's fun because people are calling out different things. It's just body weight stuff. So you're not going to blow your circuits or mess up your nervous system. And people will laugh when people call a high number. Sometimes people call less. And it's just this group of also uncertain and novel dynamic. And it really made for a great recovery day. I'll use dice as well a lot. So I'll use dice for different recovery days, and I'll have athletes roll dice and whatever it says you run. I don't do that every single day, but I do it enough so that we don't get stuck in only one way of thinking. All right, moving on. Performer-environment relationship. So what this is simply is try this for yourself. Go ahead and you're trying to jump as high as you can. Task 1 is to go and jump at a basketball hoop or a vertec or a high branch or to block a shot even, something that involves a task. The next thing you'll do is just jump off the ground as high as you can. So just jumping as high as you can just for the sake of doing it. And what you'll find so often is that when you just jump as high as you can and you don't have any goal or target, is it does not feel as high, not nearly as high, as powerful, or as coordinated as when you have a target, something that is in the environment, something that carries meaning. And I found this was actually my master's thesis research, was determining different types of depth jumps. So jumping or dropping from a box. We used an 18-inch high or a 45-centimeter box, dropping off of that. And then you would either just jump off the ground as high as you could and land, or you jump over a hurdle, or you would jump up and touch a vertec. And the targets or the tasks they caused the output there was higher jump heights and higher force outputs at the key joints of jumping versus just jumping as high as you can. You needed something to engage the body to produce a higher output. So not only, again, do you jump higher, but you also get more out of the body in doing so. And so this performer-environment relationship is key in what we would call the ecological model. That's often used in motor learning, how we learn, how we move. But within those models, it's really important to understand that we are not separate from our environment. And when we can take an environment first, so looking at tasks first, looking at constraints first, before we start laying into cues and do this, that, and the other thing, that's a really important element of getting the most out of a training session. I'm not saying there's not a place for those more remedial drills or cues. I do think they have a place. But I think that the first and foremost task is setting up a stimulating, rich environment for athletes to move, to problem solve, and to hopefully figure as much out as they can themselves to form connection themselves, and then fill in the gaps with needed drills or more remedial work. But the whole food, as Rafe Kelly puts it, is, and he talks about that in context of play and whole movement, and then the supplement being more traditional training. The whole food, when it comes to anything that we're doing, is something that really puts the environment first. So that could be as simple as, and you could also say too, if you're looking to sprint, that could be sprinting with a timing system. Sprint as fast as you can with a timing system. We all know that, and it's been said, and this is very simple, and I think it is obvious and straightforward, is that unless you're timing a sprint, you're not really working top speed. And you can see the same thing. You can just try to sprint as fast as you can without a timer versus sprinting as fast as you can with a timer. And even in your own body, as you understand it, there is a difference there. And so with those tasks, if it comes to sprinting, there's a lot of environmental differences that we can lay down. You can run for time. You can run against other people, so you can do racing. You can chase or be chased. You can chase or be chased over hurdles or through some form of obstacle type course. You can chase an object. You can throw a ball and chase after it. So these are all things that can offer that stimulus to sprinting that is so important, and then the body can follow suit. And depending on what you're going for, you can then pick your stimulus. So, for example, as well, if you wanted to work on some of the characteristics of more top-end speed sprinting or more track style sprinting, so a more aerial form of sprinting, you could run the mini hurdles or wickets. That's something you can change in your environment. And ideally, I like those over low or with lower heights, so you don't overdo some of those step over the knee type cues that can actually slow down the horizontal foot speed. But you could do those wickets or mini hurdles, and you could race over those. So you could set them up and you could have a race. So not only are you getting that stimulus that forces you to pick up the foot just a little more quickly, but you're also getting a stimulus of a race and a racing intensity. So always looking at those things in the environment is really important when it comes to an ultimate training program. And I think that really goes back as well to the physical education. And as I mentioned, things like jumping through hoops or jumping over hoops. You could look at that for anything, really. You could look at it with throwing and range or target throwing. There's something in your environment that makes you lock onto. And I find that to be more powerful to have a lot of throws done to a range, to a target, versus having them all just as far as possible. Because it's more gamified to have target type work. It really it focuses the timing of the body to be able to do that kind of thing. And you can take this out to pretty much any skill that you're doing. So versus things that are all maximal, if we can have environmental cues and constraints and stimuli, we can not only reach a higher level of motivation for the body to output, but we can also refine that output to the environment. So within that, certainly an important piece of the whole thing. And then finally, there's also a flip side of that I'll mention very quickly, is we have the outer world and the outer environment, but then there's also the inner environment. So that's things like A lot of times in lifting, for example, this could be the case where if everything is the outer environment, okay, well, everything in the weight room is measured and bar velocity and wattage, and those are good things. Like if you want to get more powerful, having like wattage on a Kaiser jumper is awesome. Or occasionally throwing a bar speed monitor on a high pull is also a really good thing. But at the same time, if we do it for everything, we can miss some of the inner game, the inner stillness that comes from that, like holding a lunge or just getting a pump in movements and feeling that in your body in a more inner state and sense. So sometimes that relationship can turn inwards, but a lot of our overall focus, especially for athletic performance, happens between ourselves and the environment outside of ourselves. Along with that, and this is the next key, is a complete program. If you're looking to improve outputs, no program is complete without some form of leaderboard and some form of formalized testing that goes with that. So if we're going with the sprinting theme, the most simple possible way to talk about that is what Tony Holler has popularized: rank, record, publish. I've seen successful gyms. Any gym that has successful outputs, be it lifting, sprinting, jumping, and those high-end athletic things or high-end athletic outputs, has record boards, has leaderboards, has things you can PR in and set personal bests in on a regular basis. And that was one of the big things with the old bigger, faster, stronger programming, is there was always different ways to set a PR and set a personal best. And this is where we can actually get quite creative with the training process, because within those leaderboards, so yes, if it's something simple like a sprint, like a 30-meter sprint or something, and you rank, record, and publish the team so your score goes up on the board, yes, that's going to change the environment. That will change your environment, so it might cause you to think a little bit differently about your day and your daily process leading up to that test. You might try a little bit harder to get to bed on time or to be on top of your nutrition a little bit better just by doing that, even the way that you're thinking about that test later that day. And like Tony says, nobody forgets their spikes that day when the test and it's ranked, recorded, and published. If it's timed sprints and we're ranking it, you're going to be incentivized to do those things. So simply having those that public ranking is a big thing in that environmental relationship. But I would say that there's also a lot of potential creativity as an offshoot there, because you don't have to have only a singular item that you can do that with. You can also come up with jumps decathlons, for example, or power quadrathons. So in track and field, a common track quadrathon is, and this actually came from throws, so an assessment of throwers. I think it might have been from British track and field, but there was 4 events and they were each assigned a point value. I think it was just 1 through 100. But you had a 30-meter dash, a shot put, so 16-pound shot thrown backwards overhead, standing long jump or standing broad jump, and then a standing triple broad jump, so 3 consecutive broad jumps. And a lot of track programs in the fall, so they'll compete in the winter and spring, but in the fall, their competition is seeing how high you can get those 4 numbers. And that goes for not just throwers, but sprint groups and jump groups. And it offers a different form of competition. And it's also really cool to have multiple tests and scores that go with that test. One way I took this was with Ty Leash, who was a sports performance coach who worked at EvoFit in Mainville, and it's a gym that I work out of a lot of times training athletes. Is we had kind of a whiteboard session, and we went. He was working with a local football team, and it was their off season, and we were just talking about weekly training. I think at first, like breaking down the week and some ways to fit speed and strength throughout the week, And I don't remember I think it might have been a podcast I had probably done and it was fresh in my head, but we came up with a triathlon for that group and for the football group. And it was 40-yard dash, standing broad jump, and then bench press because it's football and the coaches like it. So, but you got a score for each of those 3 things. And then we had wristbands or ideas for wristbands based on performance. And the feedback was just incredible from doing that, based on, okay, you scored 2,000 points, you get this color wristband, you get 2,100 points. So it takes some of those, that idea of just total performance outputs and puts a little bit more behind it, that testing, that leaderboard. Absolutely. I just think it takes the stimulus of training to a different level. And again, any gym that has seriously high outputs has some sort of record boards, and it is specific. So if you're a powerlifting gym, yes, very specific to what you're doing. But if it's not powerlifting, yes, you can have a few strength things, like I mentioned, like a bench press piece, things like that. But ultimately, you want them to be as specific, but different at the same time, but relatively specific to the actual speed and velocity based demands of your sport. There's other decathlons. You can go into track and field archives. And again, just things of the past. A lot of this came out of past decades, 80s and the 90s. I had some correspondence with a Russian high jump coach and a guy who was still jumping at least 6'8", 6'9" at age 40. And absolutely loved, he was a treasure trove of all this information from some of the Soviet methodology. And he had set a jumps decathlon they would do in the off season. I think it was on Sunday or Saturday or something. But they had 10 events. I think they did all of them in one shot, which I would probably do, this in several training sessions throughout a week. But the first test was 10 jumps on the left leg. The second test was 10 jumps on the right leg. So you got points for all these. Then a standing triple jump. Then a triple jump, but you get 5 steps leading into it, a standing long jump, and then 5 were throws, so explosive throws. So a shot put, 16 pounds, 2 hands between the knees forward as far as you can. Then a shot put, 16 pound, 2 hands backwards over your head. Then the same thing with a 9 pound, 2 hand forward throw, 9 pound, 2 hand backward throw, and then they did a regular shot put. With either a 16 or a 9 pound, which I find that funny to think about. A high jumpers doing regular shot put, but to be completely honest, shot put is such, it's only you need to set up, right? You need a safe zone, hopefully some sand or sandy type surface for it to land in. But just any athlete doing a shot put is a really athletic thing. And I've seen coaches, I think it was Grant Fowler had athletes doing like a dumbbell, kind of chucking a dumbbell like a shot put. So it's just a great thing for athletes. But your creativity is, it's unlimited with these types of things. So if you can find some relatively close KPIs to your sport that are also maybe a little different just for that novelty, and it doesn't have quite the pressure of your exact event, but they're in that close ballpark, put a score to them, be creative, see what happens. It is a really cool way to expand that programming and the possibilities in the programming. Next is using risk. And so this was a podcast idea came from a podcast I did with Flynn Disney. Flynn is a parkour coach, a strength coach, does a lot of mind and body type work. He's awesome. I think his work is it's up and coming. And I think it's going to be a lot more common and popular, that link between the mind, the body, and the environment in training. And something that Flynn had said, this is a quote he had on the podcast, is, if I experience something that is possible, but not completely unimaginable, I will get a surge of energy. Now he's speaking to risk there. So for example, if I'm just doing bounding exercises and I put down 6-inch high boxes, or maybe let's say they're 12 inches high. So, you might fall, but you could imagine what happens if you mess up, which could be a rolled ankle. Chances are you probably just bail out in kind of a bad way, but you're probably not going to get hurt, really. I'm sure somebody could in that. And that's why it's a risk. It's a small risk, but it's an imaginable risk. You would get a surge of energy doing that type of activity. Versus now think, okay, I'm bounding box to box, but what if those boxes are 3 feet high now? What if they're 8 feet high? And once you start getting up there, it becomes unimaginable to fall. You don't even want to think about it. And then you're just going to more likely than not pretty much tighten up. Of course, that's a high level parkour athlete who can do some of those things where they can do it and not tighten up. But the moral of the story here is selecting just very low level, reasonable risk. And by me even bringing this topic up, I'm not saying, go out and have 3-foot boxes and have your athletes go over them. Obviously, use common sense, be safe, but some things that you can do that have just slight risk. They're exciting and they can bring some of that surge of energy would be if you have boxes, soft plyo boxes, especially if it's not wood, it's great, but bounding across soft plyometric boxes, even on a single leg, and there's just a little bit of height difference, like I've posted that the old Russian high jumpers used to do. You can run over hurdles. So honestly, in track and field, just doing the hurdles, there is a risk there that brings, in my opinion, a rush of energy because you're probably not going to hurt yourself. You could. I mean, I actually messed up my pelvis my freshman year of college because I came off a hurdle wrong and landed on a straight leg, and I couldn't even jog for a week. But outside of that, never had an issue. You always see those fail videos where someone's hurdling and trips over the hurdle or something. So there is a risk, but that risk brings a rush of energy. And these are track hurdles, of course, they're a little bit harder. They do fall over when you hit them, but with the current situation of just commerce and buying things, you can get dog agility hurdles, and they will. I mean, there's almost no chance you're even going to get hurt at all on those. The bar falls off incredibly easily, but it is still a barrier. It is still something that gives a little bit of a rush to jump over. So just involving hurdles and training can be something that can help there. You can also do things like there's various medicine ball games that can offer that little bit of risk and rush. So things like medicine ball volleyball, for example, or Hoover ball, or basically where you're throwing something that's kind of heavy. You don't want to mess up when you catch it. It is something that's, pretty impactful flying through the air, and something like that does have a low level, acceptable for many coaches, amount of risk to it that can really advance the energy in that game. You also have roughhousing games, of course, basic low-level wrestling and grappling games suitable for athletes that offer that rush, that low level of risk. You also have, and this is funny, this is actually something more in the physical education world, things for kids. Michael Zweifel had like a pole vault for kids, whereas I think it was just PVC pipes, and he called it Cross the River. And you just took your maybe 6 foot or 5 foot long PVC pipe, pretty sturdy, and you use it as a little vaulting pole across just gymnastic mats. So you planted between and vaulted across. One funny story, actually, I saw this in swimming, is a few kids on the team at Cal had a club coach who had them do, and I'm not sure how far, I only go so far with this. I'll tell you the version I do that has a slight bit of risk to it and therefore has that energy and excitement. But he would have kids lying on the ground, throw a medicine ball up in the air. You have to spin around and catch it, that kind of thing. Or you threw up a medicine ball in the air, do a 360 and then catch it. So stuff that, and I would wonder, I kind of saw it okay, it's risky and it's athletic. I think that was the thing. But I had some kids who loved it. And then some kids said, it's scary, I don't really like that. So you have to know your audience, and you have to do something that's appropriate. But what I will do on occasion is I'll do things like, if you have a medicine ball, you can throw it straight up like a Viking throw, or just a straight, you bring it down like a power clean and throw it up. And then you do a lateral bound to the right, bound back to the left, try to catch it on rhythm and sequence, and you keep doing that. And it's low risk because you're probably not going to hit yourself with it, but you do have to watch out for it, so it demands attention. And you're also getting, again, that performer environment. It's a task-based relationship, and it's more dynamic than just doing throws. And so you could use that for warm-up to generate energy basically in a warm-up. It's very stimulating. And so things like that offer a level of stimulation. So always thinking about that low level, appropriate level risk to give you a rush of energy. Oh, the other thing I did want to say too, again, along the lines of just low risk things that are fun. Jeremy Frisch on a recent podcast talked about holding young athletes' hands, running and pulling them faster than they can actually run. And it gives them a huge rush of energy. It's a lot of fun. I guarantee they're smiling and laughing, and occasionally maybe they stumble and roll over and probably laugh along the way. I've seen Austin Jochum do that with faster athletes, holding hands with slower athletes and pulling them. And there's, again, that rush. There is a little risk because you don't want to stumble. So these are examples of more appropriate things that can offer that surge of energy into a program. The last key, I'll say this to close this all out, is just simply train yourself. So if you're an athlete listening to this, obviously you are training yourself. But if you're a coach, one of the ways to work through all these things is to experience them yourself, to feel in your own training the things that your athletes will be feeling in the programming. And as Darian Barr would say, he always says, if you're a chef, taste your own cooking. And I just think it's really important to do so, because in the process of that, you will come up with your own creative solutions that can incorporate the things that I've talked about here and all other traditional facets of training on a higher level. So that concludes this episode. If you enjoyed the show, I do have a course in the works that touches on many of these concepts and the spirit of athleticism fusing with strength and outputs, and it's called Athletic Fusion. That will be coming out in the coming year. I do have a swim book, a strength training for swimming book I'm finishing up in the process. I also have along these lines a in-person seminar in Cincinnati, Ohio, July 11th and 12th. You can find that on the Just Fly Sports website. That is the Elastic Essentials Level 2 seminar. Thank you so much for tuning in to this solo episode. Appreciate you being here, and I'll see you next week.